Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. This is the Fall 2022 PPE lecture sponsored by the Dr. Jim Lau 73 Fund. I said that right? And the Political Science Department. Please join me in welcoming Professor Aurelian Craiutu from Indiana University in Bloomington, so just down the road. He's from the Political Science Department. He's the author of several books, including A Virtue of Courageous Minds on Moderation, which is about tonight's talk. So tonight he'll be discussing radical moderation and oxymoron.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking time to spend the evening in our company on a topic that may seem counterintuitive to everyone. But before I delve into the subject of my talk, I'd like to extend my thanks to my hosts here who have been very gracious to invite me to spend a full day with me, and to those who made possible this wonderful lecture series. So my gratitude to all of them. As I said, it may sound counterintuitive to talk about moderation. Look at this room. It's full of some people, but it's not full to the extent to which it could be full, because moderation is not a very sexy topic today. Especially as we are approaching the end of our electoral campaign, we've seen a lot of vitriol, we've seen very little moderation. The temperature of the political game is very high again. And as a recent speech given by President Biden yesterday, I think it's the second one on this topic, has shown the stakes seem to be higher than ever. So let's start with a simple question here. Who needs moderation today? And there's a simple answer to that. Everyone needs moderation today, and there's an even simpler one: nobody. So when asking this question, I'm instantly reminded of Barry Goldwater's famous words from 6 decades ago. And I have circulated a handout here, and I will refer to the quotes that are on the back of page 2 of the handout. So this is the first quote: extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. This is Goldwater in '64 at the convention of the Republican Party in San Francisco. At first sight, the present moment does not seem to be ripe for moderation any more than the '60s, when Goldwater uttered these words. I should add that he uttered these words and then he went on to lose big in the presidential election of '64 to LBJ. Today we live in bubbles and echo chambers, while democratic norms are being undermined by politicians who exhibit an insatiable appetite for power and publicity. Writing about moderation, or even worse, trying to practice this virtue, seems to be a self-defeating course of action. But is this really the case? Now, as someone who has been researching this elusive virtue for some time, I have learned a few important things about them, and I'd like to share with you tonight. First, this virtue, we all know this, never makes or rarely makes the headlines in our cable news world. Rarely, perhaps never. It is absent, conspicuously so, from the agenda of our politicians, and we know who are the lions and the foxes of our world, which means those who use force or cunning to achieve their goals. But the moderates, who are neither foxes nor lions, who use neither force nor deception, they rarely appear on your radar screens. That's why writing about moderation, as well as practicing, is a niche affair that often amounts to silent condemnation, to solitude and marginality. Now, there's a second thing I've learned, which is that moderation represents an entire tradition of political thought that transcends our classical categories of left and right. In fact, this virtue forms an entire archipelago that I argue, and I have argued in my books, has yet to be fully explored. An archipelago is a series of islands that are connected under the water So it's not clear what connects them. We see the islands, but there's a connection there as well. There's a third thing I learned, which is that studying this tradition of political moderation leads one to the conclusion that the conventional image of moderation as a weak and ineffective virtue deserves to be challenged and revised. This is the lesson of Edmund Burke, who warned us 2 centuries ago that moderation has often been stigmatized as the virtue, and this is number 2 on the handout, as the virtue of cowards, and compromise as the prudence of traitors. And yet, he still regarded this virtue, moderation, as one of noble and superior minds, a powerful and cementing virtue, these are his words, indispensable to public officials. So let's be honest and admit that Burke's defense of moderation, elegant as it may be, seems so alien to us today in our age of Brexit and Trump and Putin. Why? Wasn't John Adams right, and this is the 4th quote on my handout, wasn't he right when he admitted that without moderation every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey? If so, is it the case that moderates have become perhaps a sort of endangered species that needs immediate, urgent protection? So what can we do to save them from extinction? So these are serious questions that I would like to entertain with you tonight. And I'd like to discuss next the skepticism towards moderation and the causes for that, because I think we need to address this issue before we move forward. So it's no secret that moderation is an image problem in our world of fake news and alternative facts. Many who run for office today, as we speak actually, seek hyperbole and ideological intransigence, and they are keen to distinguish themselves from those who are in fact trying to work across party lines or put the country above party. Moderates have been victims, as we know, of gerrymandering, including in this state, and public insults. They have been challenged in primaries by opponents who campaign by stressing purity and litmus tests. And this seems to be kind of a universal rule today. You have to be pure on certain, like Second Amendment taxes and so forth. So no wonder then that moderation carries the connotation of weakness, timidity, and indecisiveness. On this view, moderation is practiced only by weak individuals incapable of holding firm opinions and making strong decisions. That's one view. Others equate moderation with opportunism or see it as a synonym of mediocrity and pettiness. According to this view, moderates lack moral principles, endorse dubious compromises, and sometimes defend an unsavory center, devoid of substance. If one is brave enough to believe truly in something, so the argument goes, one cannot and should not be a moderate. This is the view held by Rush Limbaugh. This is number 5 on my handout, an influential, highly influential American conservative radio host who passed away last year. He wrote this: by definition, moderates can't be brave. They don't have opinions. Brave moderates, great moderates in America's history, show me the book. Yet another view is that moderation can never be truly enough, radical enough, or democratic enough because it lacks a clear moral or political compass. According to this claim, which comes from the left this time, moderation amounts in practice to endorsing a status quo or condoning different forms of injustice. This is a form of moderation that does not care about addressing injustice or reducing inequalities. And this was, among others, the criticism addressed by Martin Luther King Jr. with regard to the moderation of the white man in his famous letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963. And there is some truth to this critique, I should add. Now, all of these critiques remind us that it's indeed very difficult to be enthusiastic about moderation. And yet, I believe that all of these critiques are based on partial misunderstanding of moderation, which is a complex virtue with many facets. How so, you might ask? First, I'd like to emphasize that we are talking here about a concept that is an old one with deep roots in classical political thought and in various religious traditions. It's not only classical Greece, antiquity, as we know it, but it's also in Judaism and Confucianism, and in other religions that I'm unaware of, because I don't know them. My ignorance is real. Enlightened minds from Plato, Aristotle, Tacitus, and Cicero to Montaigne, Montesquieu, James Madison, Burke, and Tocqueville saw something valuable in moderation that its present critics seem to miss. Tacitus, for example, called moderation, quote, the most difficult lesson of wisdom, while Montesquieu praised it in book 29 of The Spirit of the Laws, chapter 1, as the supreme virtue of legislators. The word moderation appeared many times in the Federalist Papers. I counted 11 times, but it may be more than 11, and played a key role in George Washington's famous farewell address. Our first president, when he relinquished office after 2 terms, was not only very tight, but he was convinced that moderation was a pillar of the republic, and it was a sign of power, not weakness. American democracy, he cautioned us in 1796, may be fatally weakened if we allow immoderation, ill-founded jealousies, and false alarm to dominate the political scene, opening the door to, quote, foreign influence and corruption. What all of these authors teach us is that moderation is much more than a simple trait of character, as it is portrayed by its critics, like he or she is a moderate, or a certain state of mind, or a disposition to be a moderate. In addition to its ethical meaning, which is real, it also has a distinctively political and institutional dimension, or dimensions, I should say, and represents a certain style of political action and agenda. The ethical side of moderation is the most commonly discussed one, and it is to be found in the famous golden mean, as described, for example, by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. The institutional, avoiding of the extremes, by the way. The institutional, constitutional component of moderation is lesser known and less studied, and it appears, for example, in the writings of Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, and the Federalist Papers. Moderate governments, according to Montesquieu, are those that seek to place power in different hands and balance power among different constituencies. Such governments seek to achieve a balance between various ideas, interests, and groups in society, a balance that can offer an effective way of governing divided societies without violence. And this is an important qualification. Moderation allows diversity to be governed without violence. So what the critics of moderation tend to ignore, it's precisely this, that there's lots of phases of moderation, and moderation presupposes many things. So it's contrary to the common perception. It requires first and foremost courage. That is, the courage to swim against the current. Okay? In many respects, moderates are similar to the brave tightrope walkers who must always be careful to maintain their balance and sense of direction in order to avoid falling from the wire. So it takes a lot of courage to go up the wire and maintain your balance and move forward. Now, moderation is also difficult because it defies universal claims and moral absolutes. It's easy to govern oneself according to universal rules, but in a world of politics, there are few universal rules and there are lots of circumstances. So this requires intuition and discernment, because there is no precise algorithm that could be applied indiscriminately to all situations. In some situations, you have to lean a little bit to the left. In other situations, you need to lean a little bit to the right. In others, you need to stay in the center. And last but not least, moderation also requires a knowledge of when not to be a moderate. So there are moments when it's not appropriate to act as a moderate. As such, moderation is, I would say, a virtue that is neither for everyone nor for all seasons. There are moments when it's not appropriate to act moderately. What is moderate in one context may be inappropriate in another period or context. So, what I'd like to suggest is that far from being a synonym of timidity and hesitation and weakness and opportunism, as its critics imply, this type of moderation, as I understand it, as illustrated by the thinkers that I've quoted, is rather a fighting, courageous, and non-conformist virtue that refuses the test of ideological purity and opposes zealotry and fanaticism in all their forms. It's a form of moderation that radiates openness towards one's critics and generosity towards others. and refuses to practice political vendettas, because this is what we see all around us today, political vendettas. So the question that I'd like to ask next, and this is on my first page of my handout, is what do moderates stand for? And I'd like to talk a little bit about the many faces of moderation, because this is something that is usually neglected. We talk about moderation in the singular, whereas my inclination is to talk about faces of moderation. So what is the mentality of those who put moderation first? So they share a steady preoccupation with political evil and seek to avoid the extremes of cruelty, anarchy, and civil war. This is important, I think, for moderates. They tend, second, to keep open the lines of dialogue with their political opponents in order to preserve the fundamental values of their communities. So dialogue is a fundamental value there, even with those who do not espouse their values. To this effect, they reject an all-or-nothing approach, black and white, and always keep an open mind, accepting new evidence, leaving open the possibility that they may be wrong and their opponents right, and being ready to consider arguments on all sides. In other words, what moderates do is they refuse to see the world in Manichaean terms, black and white, left and right, good or evil. There is no axis of evil in their world. And they refuse also the posture of prophets. They champion sobriety instead of prophecy. And they endorse an ethics of responsibility as opposed to an ethics of absolute ends. Sometimes this comes at personal risks and high costs. So if we are to look for a single word to characterize these facets of moderation that I emphasized, I would like to propose that we look at moderates as trimmers, concerned with preserving the balance of the state. Moderates trim, in other words, between the extremes who seek to keep the ship of the state on an even keel. This is the original nautical meaning of trimming. And this is a word that I borrow from the Marquis of Halifax, who wrote a very interesting essay in 1684 called The Character of a Trimmer. And this is how he defined it. This innocent word trimmer signifies no more than this, that if men are together in a boat, and one part of the company would weigh it down on one side, another would make it lean as much to the contrary. It happens that the third opinion of those who conceive it would do as well if the boat went even without endangering the passengers. This is the 8th quote on the back of the handout. It is from Marquis of Halifax's 1684 essay. So this is important because it shows that political trimming is not easy, it's not predictable, and there is no algorithm for it. It requires a lot of skill, a lot of courage, and a lot of risks. Being a moderate, in other words, demands precisely the skills required of a trimmer. Non-conformity, firmness, courage, bold vision, and audacity. So that is why I think to restore equilibrium in society, and I like this term of equipoise, equilibrium, balance, moderates are prepared to adopt the soundest attitudes and principles of all parties, left and right, and facilitate agreements between them in order to calm passions and reduce the temperature of the political game. In other words, they seek to protect the balance between diverse social and political forces and interests on which pluralism and freedom depend in a modern society. And this is the balance that can be found in Montesquieu's conception of moderate government, which he distinguished from immoderate governments. Moderate governments for Montesquieu, in the spirit of the laws, are intrinsically complex governments that depend on a judicious balance of powers, healthy pluralism, effective combination of interests and groups in society. This is not the work of nature, Montesquieu said. It doesn't come naturally. Okay? It's a work of art and skillful constitutional design. That's why moderation implies constitutional design. Now, moderate governments may take various institutional forms, which explains why we have many faces that relate to it. In practice, moderation sometimes amounts to finding a center between all parties. Sometimes the middle of the road is the dead center. So while it may be tempting to equate centrism with moderation, I would like to acknowledge that moderates can exist on the left, in the center, and on the right of the political spectrum. It's not just on the right, or on the left, or in the center. It's all over the place. In other words, what I like to suggest is that although there is an overlap between the spirit, the ethos of moderation and conservatism, moderation is not necessarily a conservative virtue as it is often believed. Moderates know that conservative ideas are necessary in some contexts, but they cannot offer an alternative to the direction in which we are moving most of the time. This is actually a quote from Hayek. Moderates do not fear change or new ideas, nor do they profess a particular fondness for authority, which I take it to be a hallmark of conservatism. Instead, I prefer to define moderation as an eclectic virtue that combines a little bit of everything. So this explains, in my understanding, why moderates have worn many masks, so to speak, over time. The list of the masks worn by moderates is long, and that includes the stoic in the works of Seneca, the prudent man in the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, Guicciardini, and Baltasar Gracian, the trimmer in the works of Halifax, Michael Oakeshott, and Jacques Necker, the skeptic in the works of Hume, Kant, and Montaigne, the pluralist in the works of James Madison and Isaiah Berlin, the individual above the fray, this is George Washington and Alexis de Tocqueville, the critic of zealotry and fanaticism, that would be Edmund Burke and David Hume, the eclectic philosopher, the French philosopher Victor Cousin, and the committed observer, the French sociologist and political philosopher Raymond Aron. There are concrete examples also of moderate agendas that I could mention here, and I'll give a few. The middle of the road between revolution and reaction in 19th century France. There was such a doctrine of the juste milieu. Ordoliberalism in post-war Germany that created a social market economy there. Social democracy and the New Deal as a middle ground between pure free market capitalism and full state socialism. There are elements of moderation in all of these agendas, and there were also political movements that claimed to have followed the principles of moderation. The Prague Spring Movement of 1968, which was a revolt of moderates, as the French-Czech novelist Milan Kundera once claimed. The Solidarity Movement and the self-limiting revolution in Poland that were instrumental in bringing down the communist regimes in Poland. The Charter 77 in the former Czechoslovakia, led by Václav Havel, that started from a wonderful rock band called the Plastic People of the Universe, and the doctrine of the Third Way in the United Kingdom under Tony Blair. What I'm suggesting is that there are elements of moderation that can be found in all of these agendas. They are very different. They come from all sides of the political spectrum, but they have some elements of moderation. So why is this the case? Because I would like to suggest, and this is the fifth point on my agenda, there are some significant benefits of moderation. So to explain properly what all of these figures and movements have in common would require a lifetime work. I can only make a few claims here, and my argument would be that most, if not, though not all, of the advantages of moderation are linked to its eclecticism. So what are the advantages? I have, I think, 4 or 5. So let's start with the first one. I think the greatest advantage of moderation, as I define it, as I understand it, it is not an ideology with fixed contours. Okay? So it's not socialism, it's not capitalism, it's not communism or something like this. It's much more than the proverbial golden mean between the extremes. It has affinities with different political traditions, and it can accommodate a wide range of political ideas, views, and options. And this flexibility, I think, arguably constitutes one of its greatest benefits, because it allows moderates to get things done where others who are wedded to a particular ideologies may be unable to do so. Because if you are too wedded to one particular ideological lens, then you are going to fail to take benefits of opportunities for change when they arise. The second advantage of moderation is that it allows one to think, and this is an important point in my view, it allows one to think politically. And I draw here a distinction between thinking politically and thinking ideologically. Moderates believe that having political opinions is not a matter of embracing an ideology once and for all. It is simply a question of being able to make sensible decisions in changing circumstances that are always in flux. As such, moderation is often an effective means for promoting changes. It's not a way to sustain or protect the status quo. It's rather a way to make piecemeal, small changes where others would deny their possibility. I'd like to give you the example and the career of Abraham Lincoln. His example shows the radical as well as the realistic side of moderation. The subtitle of my talk is Radical Moderation or Oxymoron. Moderates like Lincoln start by looking at the world as is, not as it should be, through an ingenious veil of ignorance. They think politically, that is, they choose the lesser evil rather than seeking for the perfect outcome. They understand that most often the best we can do is to maintain a precarious equilibrium that allows us to avoid intolerable choices. And this is the first requirement for a decent society. What does it mean, in other words, to think politically? I'd like to press this a little bit further. Those who think politically rather than ideologically refuse to define one single best way. There is no such thing as one single best way in all circumstances that would be considered as a panacea. Okay? Aware that the political good is multidimensional and pluralistic, moderates are against perfectionism and prefer to advocate peaceful reforms rather than totally changing reforms. They do not seek quick solutions to complex problems. They understand that in politics, as well as in life, there are no absolute blueprints or final synthesis between values that are in conflict with each other. The best we can achieve is a fragile balance between competing values, always under threat from the extremes. So moderates appreciate complexity, they do not shy away from acknowledging the values and the benefits of complexity, and they distrust simple political systems and simple political proposals. They defend pluralism of ideas, principles, and interests in society. So diversity is embedded into this view of moderation. Now we come to the third benefit of moderation, which is that those who embrace this virtue usually have a flexible and skeptical mindset, which is the opposite of dogmatism and fanaticism. It allows us to correct our mistakes and be prepared to make the necessary trade-offs between conflicting values and principles. We do have the right, in other words, to hesitate, compare, and balance different solutions in each situation according to the limited knowledge and information at our own disposal. Such an anti-perfectionist and pragmatic moderate position was expressed by Benjamin Franklin, for example. When asked about what he thought about the new US Constitution, this is the seventh quote on the second page of the handout, Franklin opined, "I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution, for when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all of their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinions, their local interests, and their selfish views. Thus I consent, sir, to this constitution because I expect no better, and because I'm not sure that this is not the best." These are the words of a moderate. I expect no better, skepticism, and because I'm not sure that it is not the best. Acknowledgement of the limited knowledge. The fourth benefit of moderation is that it promotes civility and compromise, two values that undergird the functioning of our democratic institutions. Moderation makes our minds simultaneously firm and flexible, and promotes a mindset favorable to compromise and dialogue, which is no small matter after all, because it weeds out fanaticism and dogmatism, along with any crusading mentality that you are engaged on a crusade to bring either the good into the world or to eliminate the agents of the evil, in the name of fidelity to utopian principles or agendas. And it gives to social life that kind of temper and common sense that is conducive to what we call civil politics, that does not use litmus tests or purity tests. So, in so doing, I think moderation protects us against becoming self-righteous and teaches us two virtues that we so rarely exercise, humility and self-restraint. This is the 10th quote on the handout, and I'll come back to it in a moment. It's a beautiful quote coming from the pen of Judge Learned Hand. This is based on the conviction that others may be wrong or may be right, but nonetheless they are entitled to voice their views, and that we stand to learn something important even from their and from our mistakes, even from their mistakes. It's something like the art of conversation that requires a talent for speaking, listening, and keeping silent, along with a good sense of irony and courtesy needed to prevent futile quarrels and violent episodes. So there's a fifth and a sixth benefit of moderation. The fifth one is that moderates promote dialogue. They are committed to dialogue and are opposed to monologue. They are opposed to bubbles. They are opposed to echo chambers. Their motto is, may the other side be heard. No ideas astonish them, no beliefs should offend them. And they demand that dissenting voices be heard when everyone around them would rather silence them. Moderates claim the right to weigh the pros and cons in each case, and for them the world is a vast school of inquiry. There's no cancel culture for them. They are ready to learn a lot from the world as a school of inquiry. No conclusions, they believe, should be formed on partial views. We should always work with a reserve clause in our minds that we may be wrong and our opponents may be right. So the last one, there are lots of benefits, I'm tired, is that there are many different traditions, cultures, and religions that are able to accommodate moderation. And I see this as a plus. The latter, moderation, is at home not only in an Aristotelian or a Christian framework or culture, but also in a Jewish, Confucian, and even Islamic setting. Also, it's likely to espouse a different form in each context, but moderation can be accommodated within different religious, philosophical, and political traditions. A fundamental idea, I think, can be found in all major moral and religious traditions, namely that safety lies in taking the middle course in life by seeking to achieve through moderation a balance between too little and too much. The assumption is that we can taste the joys of life only if we are temperate in our desires and pursuits. That's when we taste it best. So I'd like to conclude by doing something that is totally opposed to the principles of moderation that I've outlined, which is to present some rules for moderates. I think I ended my book that Nick mentioned, Virtue for Courageous Minds, with a decalogue of moderation. It's nothing more, let's say, opposed to the spirit of moderation than to present a decalogue. So I thought that instead of 10, I should have only 5 rules for you, half of a decalogue. So I'd like to return to our initial question here to conclude who needs moderation today. And I think that if you agree with at least a part of what I said, perhaps the question that I asked should be rephrased: what kind of moderation might we need in our hyper-polarized world today? Not whether we need it, but what kind. And this is where I like to return to Judge Learned Hand. This is the quote number 10 on the back of the handout. I would say that it's very difficult for us to define the spirit of moderation. Okay? I tried to suggest that it's an archipelago and it has many phases. To paraphrase Judge Learned Hand, it is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of moderation is a spirit which seeks to understand the minds of those men and women, the spirit that weighs their interest alongside its own without bias. I've paraphrased what he says about liberty with moderation. What we know for sure, it is not the spirit of the false moderation of the white man denounced by Martin Luther King Jr. So that's the wrong moderation, and it is something that is not the true one that I have in mind here. We can no longer accept any form of moderation, in quotation marks, that condones forms of injustice and oppression. What we need instead, and I think we can have, based on the examples that I've shared with you, is a muscular and radical form of moderation that does not call for an illusory form of bipartisanship. You can be a partisan and a moderate at the same time. It does not search or condone for safe spaces or lukewarm solutions. The moderation that I am seeking is a form that trims between the extreme without making unreasonable concessions to them. This radical form of moderation consists in affirming one's positions firmly, with civility, while opposing all forms of fanaticism and ideological intransigence, my way or the highway. Much like Washington and Lincoln's type of moderation, it combines prudence and self-restraint with a sense of proportions and firmness of character. This is, again, a bold type of moderation. It's not for everyone, it's not for all seasons, it requires a lot of courage. It refrains from attacking persons, issuing prescriptions, enforcing litmus tests, or condoning any form of violence. It does not see the world in the us versus them terms. This form of moderation challenges received dogmas with a mixture of irreverence and humor. As such, it has nothing in common with the weakness that is ascribed to moderates, and it is an audacious type of moderation that does not accept half measures when it comes to defending democratic principles, values, and norms. So those are sacred. So this brings me to the few reasons for optimism for those who take an active interest in politics today. Some of you may be interested in being part of our political life, and I hope you'll be more successful than our contemporaries. 5 decades ago, a famous community activist from Chicago by the name Saul Alinsky published a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals. It's a book still in print 50 years later. It was a passionate counsel on how to bring social change in a turbulent age. The book was published in 1971. Rules for Radicals was its title, and it became an instant bestseller that influenced a subsequent generation of community activists, including Hillary Clinton, I was told. What would the rules for realistic and pragmatic moderates look like today? Okay, so instead of 10, as I said, I'm going to spare you 5, so I'm going to offer you 5 such rules and let you find out the other 5. Okay? Rule number 1, refuse to define one single best way. Do not have fixed dogmas when it comes to politics. Instead, examine facts and be prepared to amend and nuance your beliefs when facts change. If facts change, then change your views. Rule number 2, avoid echo chambers and bubbles, and do not be sectarian in affirming and defending your values. Always try your best to think politically rather than ideologically. Keep the lines of dialogue open with your opponents, even when that may be uncomfortable or difficult. It's not always possible, but most of the time it is possible with a little bit of effort. The benefits of doing so will outweigh the costs. Number 3, do not be a perfectionist. Start working with the world as is, not as it should be. Defend, where possible, piecemeal reforms rather than utopian blueprints for change. Remember that the world is made of many shades of gray, 50, maybe less, but certainly more than one. And gray too can be beautiful. Rule number 4, do not become obsessed with purity tests, axis of evil, red lines, or litmus tests. Resist the temptation to divide the universe between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, because you never know on which side you may end up at the end of the day. And number 5, don't be so sure you'll be on the side of the good. Number 5, remember, no particular belief should hurt you in political life. Don't be a snowflake. Admit that most political issues have more than one side. As a result, resist the temptation to interpret political events in light of one single value: equality, liberty, justice, or pro-life, pro-choice, New Green Deal or no deal, lower taxes or higher taxes, Second Amendment or no Second Amendment. Be prepared to make reasonable adjustments and strike compromises for the sake of maintaining the balance of our democracy. So I'd like to end by quoting the words of a courageous intellectual who endorsed such a radical form of moderation, because I'm not talking in abstract here, in dark times. And this is the French novelist and philosopher Albert Camus. For him, moderation defined as a sense of measure and proportions entailed great risks and tensions. His defined moderation, proper to burning hearts, was supposed to be in the service of justice, and this is how he understood his task, to serve justice. He always insisted, and this is something that I always admire in his work, on using plain language and clear ideas so that not to increase the world of lies and deception. And he managed wonderfully to live up to this task. And this is the 9th quote on the handout. Tocqueville thought that our world does not need tepid and lukewarm souls. It needs instead burning and passionate hearts, men and women who know the proper place of moderation. To him, and I fully endorse this view, moderation was a source of strength, not weakness. It was risky. It was, however, the guiding principle of a decent society. And this is what he fought for until his death, early death in 1960. Now, when he wrote these lines in 1944, this was true. So the question that I'd like to end up with and leave you to think about it is, does this message, his message, still hold true today when we face new challenges that threaten our free way of life? And I think that there's no better way of ending my lecture tonight than by inviting each of you to think about this question on your own, because at the end of the day, you may know the answer better than me. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for questions, but I'm going to take the prerogative and ask the first one. So your talk is really kind of reminding me of a recent controversy of Brown University economist Emily Oster just wrote an article in the Atlantic calling for, amnesty for what we said during COVID, right? And she's been attacked on both sides, I think, for this view. With people on the one side being like, oh, well, we lost freedoms because of this, while on the other side it's like, well, these are people who put us in danger by putting this in an externality, right? And so it seems like she's taking a very moderate stance on kind of this issue, but is it proper, given that either side you're on, this could be viewed as almost an injustice? Where would that be? How would we place something like COVID
in this story?
In this story, yeah.
Look, you invite me to speculate on an issue that I know as much as anyone else here, or as little. So we don't know the source of COVID. Still, speculations.
That's kind of her argument. She was like, look, we didn't know anything. The science was rolling out as we were doing these things. So
I think that a modern position is that we follow science. We follow those who study this. We all have opinions. But, remember, Plato said we all have opinions, but true knowledge is hard to obtain, and not everyone is capable of doing so. So I think a sense of humility here would be useful, and a sense of self-restraint. I have my own worries about the world ahead of us. So rather than fixing my attention on what happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I would want to prevent such horrendous events from happening in the future. So I want to give a positive look to that rather than bickering about who released that or where it appeared. So, I think we need to learn more about this and be very cautious with our assertions about this. This is one of those topics on which I do not feel qualified to express a last judgment. There are many such topics on which I do not feel qualified, but nonetheless, this doesn't impede me from talking. But I think the point is to know the limit where probably you should not venture out beyond your safety.
So I'm curious how Plato would fit into this. So for him, moderation is moderation of the desiring and appetitive part of the soul, not moderation of the calculating or spirited part, right? So how he's not moderate about pursuing knowledge or truth. So how would that come into the story? I assume that's the ethical that you mentioned?
Yeah, but with Plato we can start from his analogy between the city and the soul. First, you can't have moderation in the city unless your soul is in order. So that balance, it has to be a balance. I think moderation has balance that appears in both the Republic, but also in another dialogue that I remember in Charmides, where he makes that point very clearly. But it is mostly the ethical component of moderation. If you want the institutional one, you need to look into Aristotle's works, because there you have the metaphor of the rule of law, excuse me, the mixed government, rule of law, balance of interest, the importance of the middle class in book 4, chapter 11 of the Politics. So those elements are not present in Plato. Plato is more the ethical component. But some authors, I think, rightly claim that if you want to study moderation, you need to start with Plato, or maybe even earlier with Thucydides. That's why I mentioned Thucydides earlier. But the idea that in order to have a moderate city, you need to have balance at home, in the souls. I think that's a challenging one. But it has to be complemented with institutions. The institutional aspect of moderation is the least studied one.
So the primary contexts that you talk about, the application of moderacy, the functional value of it, is a polarized environment and a pluralist environment. And like, I sort of imagine you as like an advisor of someone entering a context that's either hyperpolarized or pluralist and saying, oh, listen to the virtues of moderacy. It's going to help you navigate these environments. And I find that incredibly appealing and it makes a lot of sense. In your rules, you said avoid echo chambers and bubbles. And so...
As much as you can.
Yeah, and it doesn't, I guess my question is, what if the context that we're confronted with is a monoculture with a hyper-majority versus hyper-minority position? What are the functional mechanisms and virtues of moderacy in that environment?
Well, it's a difficult question. If I had the answer, I would be advising for big bucks. I would say that if we have the situation that you described, then we are in an unhealthy situation to begin with. So it's very difficult to redress and find a way out of that. I think that echo chambers and bubbles are very dangerous to the health of democracy. I'm saying the truth here. Everyone knows that. But in a way, it requires each of us to make an effort to get out of the bubbles. So, for example, I can think of a few examples. One is, what are our sources of information? What do you watch? What do you read? Okay. Whom do you talk to? So try to make an effort to read beyond your sphere of comfort zone. That's not easy. Okay. Try to watch some channels that are not that, let's say, germane to your own views. You can always benefit from knowing what your opponents are trying to do, but always you may find something, you may learn something new. That would be one thing that we can all do, improve that. Also, socialize with people. One of the things that I ask of my students is to take the Murray bubble quiz. Are you familiar with it? Charles Murray devised a set of questions. You can Google Murray NPR bubble quiz. And there are 25 questions, if I recall, maybe 50. He extended it. But questions that are meant to measure the thickness of the bubble in which you live. For example, one of the questions is, how many people in your neighborhood do not have college degrees? Have you ever walked on a factory floor? What does Branson, Missouri, Branson mean? Okay, I gave the answer. He also asked a few questions. I mean, do you stock domestic mass-produced beer in your fridge? Not craft beer, domestic beer. Things like that. And the highest the score, the more, the thinner the bubble is. So you are more kind of normal person. The lower the score, the thicker the bubble is. I took the score. Well, I was not born here, so I have a kind of extenuating circumstance here. But my score was pretty low because I live in a bubble. I live in Bloomington. That's a bubble in itself. We need to make an effort to get out of that. How do you do that? Having some socializing events where you invite people. One of the organizations that I like to recommend to you, to students, but to everyone is Braver Angels. Braver Angels has been organizing a series of workshops in which people of different political parties come and talk together about sensitive topics like education, guns, pro-choice, pro-life. And they sit together for a day and they kind of see where they can find common ground. That's a difficult exercise. We have better things to do with our hectic, busy lives, but those kinds of organizations have kind of grown in the last 10 years. There's another one called No Labels. There are a few others that More in Common, I think, is another one. So all of these organizations are doing some work at the grassroots level that I think help us deal with the problem that you identified. It takes a long time. It's usually invisible work, unrewarded, but very, very important for the health of our democracy. If we don't have those efforts, we are not going to sustain our free way of life.
So it seems very intuitive to me and plausible that there's something about echo chambers or bubbles that fears their democratic way of life, or maybe a sign that things are not going well, the threat of democracy. But I'm just curious on your view, what exactly explains that? Like, what is it about echo chambers that's threatening democracy?
Because I think, enforce this tendency to dogmatism, Manichaeism, so they are dangerous to begin with because they separate us and make us see the world through the lenses of the agents of darkness and the agents of light. So that's the consequence. But what makes that, I think it's human nature. We all like to talk to kindred people who think like us. And the fear of diversity, this is a theme running through the history of philosophy and political thought. Fear of diversity. It's the fear of diversity from ancient Greece to today. Diversity is difficult to manage. It's beautiful. Aristotle compares democracy to a potluck feast, right? Everyone brings a little bit of, it's very cosmopolitan, a little bit of food, a little bit of customs and those. But it's not, you know, you are drawn towards your own. So I think that's in the fear of diversity is one thing. Now there are political factors that have made this problem more, let's say, acute today than ever. And those political can be accentuated by demagogues, populists, economic instability. The fear of change is another thing that's triggered. In our case, I mean, it's the dislocation brought by economic changes that have kind of emphasized the importance of tribalism, my tribe, the health of my sect, the health of my group, at the expense of others. So those would be some of the causes, but there may be others. But I don't think they are not reversible. They can be reversed. So it's just that a little bit of empathy would work well towards those from outside of your group. So cultivating empathy is actually a very important task that we all have as teachers, as public intellectuals, as engaged citizens. But empathy is in short supply these days. Yes?
Is moderation fundamentally secular? You mentioned talking about the light and the dark and how we should avoid being the other side as one or the other, because you could end up on the dark. For people that are like very religious, how can they give way on a view like abortion in terms of moderation when they may view it as evil? Does moderation reject the notion of evil?
Okay. It doesn't reject there are some evils. So, for example, sending people to gas chambers or concentration camps or gulags is evil. So it doesn't make a litmus test. That's, I said, and not in all cases. There are a lot of wide options that are moderate on the issue of pro-life, pro-choice. So it's not like black and white. That's what I would say. Okay. I don't want to get into the specifics of the topic because we won't end up on this. But you could embrace one of those middle positions. And actually, some positions are middle positions. So, for example, 15 weeks or, I don't know, after that is not acceptable, or things like this. So those are some positions. But moderation is not fundamentally anti-religion. I want to emphasize that. it doesn't apply a religious perspective to understanding politics, but it allows for the importance of religion in life. So it's not secular. If I gave the impression that moderation is wedded to a secular perspective, that's not right. As a matter of fact, some of the thinkers that I've mentioned here were not at all secular. Okay, so one of the thinkers that I like most, Michael Oakeshott, was very much into religion, but he didn't make religion a political test. Okay, so it never appears in his work. You have to look for his journals to see how important religion was for him. He was a political moderate. So I think that there are some issues on which there's no compromise with, again, gas chambers. There's no compromise there. But most of the issues allow for nuances, and I think the difficulty for us is to find those nuances. I can give other examples. The Second Amendment is another thing. You don't have to outlaw or get rid of it, but you can find a middle ground there. Some things can be outlawed, some things shouldn't be outlawed. So it's never black and white. It's let me put it this way: it's rarely black and white.
So it seems like pluralism and a respect for different perspectives is so essential to the kind of moderation developed. And that seems consistent with another thing that was stated, which is that democratic values and norms are non-negotiable and sacred. Right? So, so there's a rejection of ideology and dogmatism, but there is a sort of firm foundation in democratic values and norms, right, which are sacred. Right?
Open society values and principles.
Right. So what happens when one of the plural perspectives that needs to be respected rejects democratic values and norms? How does the moderate deal
So
with that?
the values that I would put like in the sacred category, though nothing is entirely sacred until it's God's privilege. I would say it's the principles of open society. So if there is an attack on the integrity of elections, on the rule of law, there's no compromise.
So there are certain perspectives that can't be respected.
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes to defend our free way of life, we need to be intolerant towards the intolerant, so to speak. So the Germans, for example, outlawed the fascist parties' signs, symbols after World War II. So you couldn't display those in the public just because you are committed to the principle of pluralism. So I think here you allow your basic instincts to dictate what is non-compromisable, non-negotiable. And as I said, integrity of elections, peaceful transfer of power. At the end of the day, these are the values that are endorsed by Karl Popper in the Open Society and its elements. Okay, once democracy, it's a mechanism for the peaceful transition of power. It's a way to change rulers without undue violence.
If I may just quick follow up, so what, pragmatically speaking, when the perspective that doesn't deserve respect in an open society, the perspective that rejects the principles of the open society, when that perspective gains political ascendancy and power, what tools are at the disposal of the moderate on your account to confront that threat to democracy? If the moderate has to respect pluralism and a diversity of perspectives, which I assume also entails an adherence to procedural norms. Right? So what happens when that ascendant anti-democratic power takes advantage of democratic processes in order to achieve anti-democratic aims? What tools does the moderate have that don't involve betraying its fidelity to the procedures?
Yeah, well, it's what we're witnessing today. I think that we cannot allow election deniers to be in charge of elections.
But how? That's so. Like, what tools are at the disposal of the moderate?
Well, denounce them, public pressure on them, don't allow them, if possible, to serve in that capacity, try to challenge that in courts. Convince others that those are not reliable guardians of the elections. I'm not sure what you think would be but this is a problem that we are facing today, and that's a challenge, I agree. It's not only the challenge for moderates, it's a challenge for anyone, the radicals, everyone who is committed to the principles of open society struggles with that question. So limit their access to public media, speak louder than them. It's not much, but there's something there. But I would say prevent them from being selected as guardians of elections. It's a great challenge.
So can you cite historical episodes where moderation has succeeded in a crisis?
The Constitutional Convention.
Okay.
Harry Clay's compromises, 1820. Harry Clay.
Oh, Henry Clay.
Yeah. Not a great success, but it delayed the settling of the issue until the country was strong enough to sustain the civil war. It's not a compelling argument, but if the civil war had occurred in the 1820s, probably would not have lived in the United States. That's one hypothesis. I prefer Washington's farewell address, as I mentioned in my talk, because I do think that that's a programmatic text. Washington actually gave voice to the fears that Jeff outlined, and soon after he relinquished power, we had 4 years of turmoil and very contested election in 1800. So nothing is new under the sun. That's the good news. The bad news is that we are living through it. So those would be the examples that I have in mind. Lincoln is a good example as well, though Lincoln is a tragic figure in our history, and the way in which he tried to negotiate before the war, I think was not necessarily unsuccessful, but he could not prevent the onset of the war. So I would like to invoke Lincoln, but that's not the example. The other example is the Solidarity movement in Poland, which I invoked briefly in my talk. In Faces Moderation, I analyzed the political thought of Adam Michnik, and there's a concept there, self-limiting revolution, that I find interesting. So it's a changing of the communist system through small steps. So forcing the communists to, for example, respect the rule of law. Okay? So they could not fire anyone. You would have to defend their actions in court. So that was actually successful, and the Solidarity movement ended up taking that approach to a higher notch with mass protests and movements and strikes. So the Solidarity movement built upon the first movement, which was the defense of the Committee for the Defense of Workers in 76, 77. So there were such successful movements. Today, I would look at this grassroots organizations, as I said, Braver Angels, No Labels, More in Common. There are quite a few if you look at them. They are not visible nationally, maybe, but they are quite visible locally. And I think they chart a path ahead. So small steps. Yeah.
This question might be stemming from not knowing enough historical examples of where moderation has succeeded, but still I would ask, one of the rules that you mentioned was that a person should think politically. But wouldn't it be the case that for politicians, thinking politically would entail fanning the flames of extremism rather than opting for moderation? And if that is the case, wouldn't moderation remain something limited to academic circles?
Yeah, excellent question. Both questions are good. It forces me to be, let's say, more concrete here. And the answer is no. It's precisely resisting fanning the flames of extremism, trying to find common ground, trying to put the country above your power. In a way, if you look at the example, it's what Liz Cheney has been doing. She's not successful, okay, in the short term, but I think her example is an interesting one, because she it's very conservative on the one hand, but for her there are certain values that are more important than the victory of her party. Her example is in my view, enlightening. Again, it's not a short-term success. So I think that's the example of moderation. The other one would be precisely the opposite of moderation. There are other examples in the recent history. I mean, if you look at the transition of power after Franco in Spain, you know, Franco ruled for 40 years. We should not forget that. His regime was a quasi-fascist regime at the beginning, and the transition that occurred after his death under the auspices of King Juan Carlos was a successful one because it kind of built an alliance with different political forces in the country. And this was Spain in 75, 76, 81. There was a coup d'etat, military coup, excuse me, which didn't succeed. So that's, you know, it's never easy. It's possible. The other example of successful movement is the theory of the power of the powerless in Czechoslovakia that built resistance to the communist regime, and it led to electing Václav Havel as the president of Czechoslovakia after the fall of communism in 1989. So that was a velvet revolution that started early in the 76, 77, when Havel and his friends proposed the doctrine of the parallel polis, living in a city, without telling a lie. So living in truth was the doctrine that they promoted. So if you live according to that, as if the truth mattered, you can succeed. And they succeeded 12 years later, but it took a long time. So Poland, Czechoslovakia, I think, are examples that I'm mostly familiar with from my own experience. There was also another tradition of round tables, if you think about it, in Poland. So in Poland, the elections that took place on June 4th, 1989, brought for the first time ever a non-communist government to power, which took power on August 30th under the prime ministership of Tadeusz Mazowiecki. So what they did, they had the tradition of round tables in which they negotiated an exit from communism. And it was successful because, unlike my home country, Romania, where there was violence at the end of communism, in Poland and the Czech Republic, there was a velvet revolution. So the transfer of power was without much violence. Actually, no violence in Poland that I know of significant proportions. So that the concept, the velvet revolution, is another example of a successful moderation. In this country, there was a tradition of moderation in the Whig Party in the 19th century. There were some moderates even in the Republican Party up until the 1960s. So one example that comes to mind, though I know not enough to speak at length about it, is the Ripon Society from the Wisconsin place. And the Ripon Society was kind of a group of intellectuals that had moderate ideas. I forgot the name of the main representative that gave a fantastic interview and exposed the principles of Ripon Society in the Playboy magazine in an interview in 1971 or 72. Lee something, I forgot the name. It's an interesting thing. I was afraid of doing research in the library, going to ask for the Playboy magazine from April 1971, because people might have wrong ideas. But that's a tradition that has kind of disappeared in the Republican circles, and certainly today there aren't that many moderate voices. That need more of those, because it doesn't take a lot. So the impression is that you have everyone to be moderates. No, you need a modicum of moderates in both parties that would offset this balance of, offset the power of the radicals and extremists in both parties. And those have votes. In the Senate, for example, it would be the easiest to do it, because in the Senate you need one or two moderates to tilt the balance. And there were a few moderate voices, but it's never clear. But there's more hope than we can think of.
So I hope this makes sense, but I'm kind of thinking that the size and scope of the state kind of matter for this, right? I'm kind of thinking like, you know, in public choice theory, right, it's like, one of the problems is if we get, like, so Brian Kaplan argues, we can hold irrational views because, you know, look, I'm not swinging the outcome of the election. It's so big, so I can hold irrational views. Well, doesn't that make it also easier to hold more radical views and therefore make it less poignant to be the moderate that comes in, right? Like, does that affect kind of moderation if the state is too big for its own?
You could also make the opposite argument that the larger the size, the scale, I mean, the more the better, and then that deflates the importance of radicals. That would be medicine's, I think, solution to managing diversity. But I'm concerned, for example, with the issue that Jeff raised. You know, what do you do to those? I mean, practically, what do you do? You denounce them, you fight against them, you make your voice be heard louder. That's all you can do. But it has to be without violence. That's the litmus test for moderates. If there is one, there's no violence. So avoiding violence is the key. If anything, you know, the quotes that I gave on the back of the handout, I think should give you some food for thought. They are not mine. They are from people who actually worked in politics, and I had something important to say. And some said intelligent things, some said stupid things, like Rush Limbaugh. But I think that we are left with a challenge, which is number 6 on the handout, which I didn't point in my talk, is from Tom Friedman. Extremists tend to go all the way, and moderates tend to just go away. So going back to the question about what we can do is to create public spaces for voices of moderates to be heard and engaged with. Rather than me giving a talk about moderation and, you know, trying to connect with other people who write about moderation to find kindred spirits, I think there should be more space given in our media, on our outlets to moderate voices. And rather than being ridiculed and criticized for being wishy-washy or opportunist, they should be given more credit for the important work that they are doing.
Yeah, so like some of your like examples of moderation, like early America and stuff like that, it seems like a lot of those times, like if we're all in the problem, I mean, you kind of talked about like the Civil War and slavery. It seems like they kind of like push back the problem, which in some cases, I guess, like we were a young and fragile nation, so that's good. But like the problem like didn't get solved until we had to have this like massive and bloody war, when it could have really just been solved by deliberation of people speaking about it and coming to a final conclusion and agreement instead of just prolonging this problem. So like, is there still a place for like people that are more radical to like push and like resolve that progress? Because I feel like if you just have a mostly like modern society, then it's very easy to cause like stagnation and not have
Absolutely.
progress.
Absolutely. I'm a firm belief that we cannot be all moderates, and a city of moderates, only of moderates, would be the most boring place on earth. That's why pluralism is such an important value. You need real pluralism, confrontation of different viewpoints. So moderates actually benefit from the presence of radical voices, and conservative benefit from the presence of radical voices, because it's only then that you can see the weak points in your own views and you can correct them. So what is needed, in my view, is precisely a strong, manly, vigorous debate between different points of view. My favorite idea comes from the work of Isaiah Berlin, a political philosopher who taught at Oxford many years ago. He died in 1997. And he said that he's bored by reading people who are his allies, people who hold the same views because they are predictable. He liked to read those who were of different opinions. So he was a liberal, but he wrote about the critics of liberal society. He wrote about Joseph de Maistre and about Hamann, a German philosopher. They didn't believe in freedom, but he was attracted to them because they were making strong arguments against his own values. So I would say that we benefit, but we need And this is at the end of, I think it's at the end of book 2 on liberty. John Stuart Mill says, no, this is in the essay on Coleridge, I think. He says, the prayer of every liberal-minded person will be, God, give us strong, intelligent, and vigorous opponents so that they can sharpen our wits, make us more aware of the limitations of our knowledge and how we can improve it. So this is what we need to do, and I think that in that respect, I think the answer to your question becomes evident. We need intelligent, strong contenders. And those are not usually easy to get because we live in bubbles. And we like to be surrounded by people who think like us. And that's why I define moderation as a virtue that is eclectic, because it combines a little bit from each of the political traditions. So I may, to some of you, what I said may appear as too conservative, to some a bit too liberal. And that's good, because this is how I think moderation is. And it's this tradition. So if you take anything from the talk tonight, I'd like you to remember two things. There's an archipelago of moderation. All of these thinkers, I put them there, their names, their faces, not to show you that I've read them, because I haven't read all of them. It's because they form this archipelago of moderation. So that's one. Number two, when we study moderation, we can't understand what moderation is unless we study what fanaticism is, what extremism, radicalism is. Okay? So the opponents of moderation teach us about moderation as much as the friends of moderation. So that's why I said it takes a research team, a research agenda, not one man, one book. It's kind of, in a way, what I've been trying to do as an intellectual, as a teacher, as a scholar, is to rethink the history of political thought through the lenses of these two concepts, moderation and immoderation. So instead of talking about left and right, my perspective is very much like Montesquieu. For Montesquieu, there were two types of governments, moderate governments and immoderate governments. So I'm very much in the Montesquieuan mold, if I may say so, because for me, these two concepts can be disaggregated and can lead us in different directions, which are much more fruitful for me than socialism, capitalism, left and right.